What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So with 2017 coming to a close, I thought it'd be a fun idea to cover 5 positive improvements that Yu-Gi-Oh! Can implement going into 2018. Now, obviously, these are purely suggestions, but funny enough, some of these have already been implemented in certain ways, and you'll see what I mean once we get into it. As much as we love Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's not a perfect game, but if Konami were to take our advice and implement some of these changes, not only would it make the player base a lot happier, but it would also be just good for the long term of the game as a whole. But before we get into it, I want to give a big shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout out to Kaylani, and if you guys want to help support me and the channel through Patreon, then check out the link in the description below. But let's go ahead and get right into it. So for my top 5, I've ordered these from the easiest to accomplish in terms of the most difficult, or I guess the most likely to the least likely, and that's basically from a logistical standpoint and some of the things that they would have to do in order for some of these improvements to actually happen. But we're going to start off with some of the most minor changes that they can make that could have the highest impact overall. And the first thing that they could do is remove card exclusivity by region. So what do I mean by this? Well, as a lot of you guys know, with cards like Shonen Jump promos, for instance, sometimes here in America or the US or in our region as a whole, we'll get a specific Shonen Jump promo card, but then that card will be excluded from a region like Europe for several months, if not years in some instances, and then it's just completely unfair because the card pools are separate, even though we're technically a part of the same game. And when some of these promos are actually extremely powerful and can help tip the balance of the meta one way or another, I don't think that's exactly or particularly fair for the region that has to go without those promos. Look, for instance, Utopia the Lightning. Utopia the Lightning is one of the strongest, I'm gonna say rank 4s even though it's a rank 5, but basically you go into Utopia to rank up into it, that's ever been created in this game. And the fact that Europe had to go without Utopia the Lightning during Cosmo format, where that was one of the most in-demand requested promos basically of all time, because of the fact that it actually gave people a good chance against Cosmo because you had a very solid out to killing cards like Dark Destroyer. It's not exactly fair that Europe had to go without it. Same thing goes right now with a card like Link Kuriboh. Link Kuriboh is an extremely powerful Link monster and helps enable so many different plays with so many different decks, and the fact that, while sure it's not currently legal here in the TCG, it's at least printed here, and we're basically just waiting for the green light for it to be playable. Whereas Europe, on the other hand, isn't going to have Link Kuriboh for God knows how long, and that's not fair to them because it basically makes the meta entirely different solely based on the fact that there's one promo card that one region has and another one doesn't. The same thing goes for something like TCG exclusives or OCG exclusives, because when you think about it, look at an archetype like Burning Abyss. Burning Abyss was a meta-defining TCG exclusive archetype and really helped molded how the meta here in the TCG was shaped during Duelist Alliance format. While in the OCG, they didn't have Burning Abyss, so their meta was actually entirely different. And then you have to think of the fact that the OCG got all the Burning Abyss cards at once, and then they also got Beatrice at the same time, which again shifted the entire landscape of the meta entirely because Beatrice was then an OCG exclusive for a short time, meaning that we didn't have the opportunity to play with it in our version of Burning Abyss, and so it's just so convoluted, and why does it have to exist essentially? I just want it so that essentially the card pool, for the most part, obviously the OCG is ahead when it comes to certain cards because there's several sets ahead of us, and that's totally fine. But if something comes out as a promo in Japan, it should come out as a promo in both North America and Europe and all the other regions as well at the same time, so that players aren't having to play with 3 different card bases and that it's not really confusing for players in terms of card legality and understanding what is and isn't allowed to be played. And that kind of rolls over into my second thing, where I feel like we should just merge the card pools all together. Several other card games have their cards released at the same time or released within a window of time that's definitely fair and acceptable in terms of playability. Look at other games like Magic and Pokemon. They basically all get their cards in all the different regions at the same time, or within, I would say, about a month of, each other. And that's totally acceptable. Whereas here in the TCG compared to the OCG, we're sometimes 2 sets, maybe 3 sets behind. Sometimes we don't even get a set that the OCG has here in the TCG, and we get it in some weird new manifestation. I mean, look at the Link Vrains pack as an instance. I know it's not a core set, but it's an instance of a product that we're not even going to get in the TCG, and we're going to get it in a completely different form. But if pretty much all of the card pools aligned, again, it would just make the game so much simpler for so many people, because now you're not having to question, what cards are legal at what time. And then also you have the fact that players can also pretty much brew and get really creative, because now here in the TCG, we can't just look to the OCG for inspiration of what the best decks are going to be. If everyone is on equal footing, it gives everyone an equal opportunity that when a new card gets released or announced or a new set comes out, we can all experiment at the same time and figure out what the best decks are pretty much in tandem, rather than pretty much the OCG getting all the cards. They figure out the best decks, and then when those sets come to the TCG, we basically just mirror the OCG, even though our formats aren't exactly similar. It is something that, it's pretty much something that we do as is, and that means we could also merge the ban lists as well. There's a lot of really cool benefits that we as players would gain from them merging set releases at the same time. Now, another thing I want to discuss when it comes to merging, and this is number 3, is merging rulings when it comes to cards. I think it is absolutely astonishing that cards function in a different way depending on which region you are in. If you're in Asia, or if you're in Europe, or if you're in North America, your cards function in a different way depending on the types of effects of cards that you are using. Now, I know this doesn't come up a lot because it really is very specific in the types of effects when it comes to what I'm specifically referring to, but why does it have to be this way? Why do different cards work in different ways in different regions? It just doesn't make fucking sense. You're used to playing one game here in North America, and then you decide, oh, I'm gonna go to a tournament in Europe, or I'm gonna go to a tournament in Asia, and then you go to that tournament, and your cards function in an entirely different way. I mean, look at the whole interaction, like with Call of the Haunted and Satellar Knight Deneb. In North America, you're not able to get the effect of Satellar Knight Deneb once it hits the field, but in the OCG, and I also think in Europe as well, since it technically was summoned, even though it didn't have an activation window, you're still able to get the search off of Deneb. And that actually makes a really big difference, especially at a competitive level, because your card shouldn't work differently in different regions. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Might be the only card game that has this problem, and it would be something that could be so easily fixed, because all they would have to do is just come out and say, all cards work in the same way in the same region. They would just have to definitively define which rule set we are playing by, and then basically we just go from there, and then everyone is on the same page. This whole list of improvements I want to make are to not only help make the game less confusing, but make it more accessible, especially for newer players or maybe even casual players who are looking to play the game more competitively. Hell, even for competitive players, this can sometimes be confusing, especially if you're traveling to different regions and you don't understand how these different mechanics work. Now, the next thing that I want them to change, and this is number 4, and probably this is where we're going to start getting into the more, I would say the more difficult things for them to implement, would be changing the rarity scale of the cards. The OCG actually does this very well, I feel, and that actually is part of the reason why the cards in Japan are at a much lower price point here compared to the TCG. You look at the rarity scale and the way that they do things, you've got cards like, for instance, like, look at Maximum Crisis. Dragonic Diagram was a common, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring was a super rare, and even with super rare cards, even though secret rare cards do exist in Japan, every card that usually comes in a secret rare and a core set has a super rare version, meaning there's still a much lower rarity version of it that's going to be much cheaper for players to access. But if you're a rarity whore and you really like maxing out your deck in terms of the bling, you can opt and go for the secret rare version of the card. But what I like about this is that it really benefits everyone as a whole. This means that players are going to have much more access to the cards that they need. A lot of people complain that, oh, hand traps are too expensive, or these cards are too expensive, or those cards are too expensive. If you bring down the rarity of the cards and make them much more accessible, but still implement like secret rare alternative versions of the same cards, or even ultimate rare versions of the same cards, kind of like back in the day where there were a much wider variety of ultimate rares in core sets, then not only are you appealing to the casual crowd because you're making these cards much more accessible for them from a price barrier standpoint, but then it's also appealing to the competitive crowd because cheaper cards means more people are going to be able to access them, but also competitive players do like their bling, meaning they're willing to go the extra mile and pay that extra cash just to get a shinier version of a card. So really it's a win-win. Everyone gets what they want and there's really no loser here, and Konami's going to print a shit ton of product because the thing is these products are going to have much more longevity, because maybe if the set becomes less relevant, they're still going to want to go back and open these sets because there's going to be those sought after secret rare or ultimate rare versions of specific cards that players are still going to desire. So again, it's a win-win for everyone and it's going to make the player base much more happy as a whole. Now going on to number 5, and the last thing I want them to implement for one of the biggest positive changes they could possibly do to Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2018, that would be a dedicated online platform of impeccable quality. Now, I'm not talking about Duel Links here, because I know a lot of you guys are going to think about that, but Duel Links is kind of on the right track. I'm talking about something where it's the full-fledged game, but it has the quality of something that they put into like Duel Links, or something that's on the level of something like Hearthstone. I want to see a game where I can play real Yu-Gi-Oh! Against real opponents in real time, pretty much anywhere in the world. I have access to the card pool. I basically can just play with my friends at any time. I can go to a YCS and play locally with people. There would be so much value that they would get from releasing a full-fledged version of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game in a mobile platform. You can make it for PC, for Mac, for Xbox, for PS4. There's so many cool things that they could do with this. I mean, not only are you giving a place for people to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, and I mean real Yu-Gi-Oh!, not speed duels like in Duel Links, you're giving people access to Yu-Gi-Oh! From whether they're a beginner, if they're an intermediate player, or an advanced competitive player. You have both of your audiences, your casual audience being pleased because they have the ability to play, but then you have your competitive audience as well. You could implement a ladder system very similar to something like Hearthstone. There's so much potential here, and I just would really love to see something like that be implemented, because if we're talking about long-term growth for this game, and if we want to get more players interested in Yu-Gi-Oh! And really teaching them correctly, then this would be the best thing that Konami could possibly invest in if they're looking at the long term of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole. So guys, those are just my thoughts on some things that I would love to see positively improve Yu-Gi-Oh! Going into 2018. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think we could do, or some suggestions we might be able to give to make this game even better than it already is. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.